My name is Stephanie. I will be your moderator for this session. I'm an independent consultant, but closely associated with IUFRO. I'm a deputy coordinator on the IUFRO task force on transforming forest landscapes to climate and human well-being. I'm also associated with the University of Geneva here in Switzerland. 20 years ago, we defined the term forest landscape restoration, and ever since I've been working on FLR. My PhD was on governance challenges and forest landscape restoration. Therefore, it is my great pleasure and honor to participate in the Global Landscape Forum today and to be a part of this session with 4 great researchers and practitioners. The session is diverse and will consist in audience polls, short presentations, a panel discussion, and a Q&A session at the end. So we're hoping that it will be a lively and interesting session. For now, just so that you can all be prepared, you can see on your screen the link to the Slido so that you can be prepared to participate in our polls. You can either go onto slido.com and join the conference and select the appropriate session, or you can just click on the QR code. So we will start right now with the first poll. We have a couple of questions for you. So the first question is to find out a bit more about you. Where are you joining us from today? And in French, d'où nous rejoignez-vous aujourd'hui? So we're really keen on getting an idea of the diversity of our participants. We've got one participant from Guyana. We will also have a second question coming up to try and better understand who our audience is. We'd also like to know which organization you're affiliated with. So this is a multiple choice question. So please fill out that form and let us know which organization, which type of organization you're affiliated with. We definitely have a majority of NGOs, it seems, but also some academia, some government, some students. So now that we have a feel for who our audience is, I think I can introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Vianney Ahimbisiwe. Vianney is a co-author of a major article on forest landscape restoration that came out last year. Vianney is from Uganda, but is currently working as a research scientist at the Thunen Institute in Germany on a project entitled Land Use Potentials and Ecosystem Service Restoration in Africa. He's also currently pursuing his PhD with the Technical University of Munich. His PhD and his work are mainly focused on the restoration of forest land use potential and ecosystem services in Africa. As I mentioned, he's co-author together with several other IUFRO scientists on a major article that came out in the journal Forests on what generates failure and success in forest landscape restoration. His presentation will give us a glimpse of this article. Vianney, the floor is yours.
Dear all, thank you for joining our session. By the names, I'm Vianney Ahimbisiwe, a research assistant at Thunen Institute of International Forestry and Forest Economics. I will take you through a short presentation looking at what generates failure and success in forest landscape restoration. The presentation is mainly focused on findings from research conducted by IUFRO and published in Hoehl et al. 2020. The main aim of the research was mainly focused on generating expert knowledge on local experiences with forest adaptive management and restoration. This information was supposed to be used to enable informed decision-making at site, landscape, regional and global level, and also enable practitioners and managers to adapt co-create best practices, approaches, and strategies and also to enable them manage and adapt to climate and societal changes. Not only that, but this knowledge would also prevent significant losses in terms of funds, ecosystems, and enhance ecosystem integrity and well-being. From the findings, we got responses around the globe. However, I will highlight the main findings on success and failure, especially from cases we obtained in Africa, as seen in Figure 2. The main findings included local stakeholder involvement in negotiation, planning, and management as a key aspect to success or failure of forest landscape restoration projects, of which this is linked to anthropogenic continued use of restoration areas for crop production, firewood extraction, and grazing. However, many respondents suggested that to avoid continued anthropogenic use of restoration areas, alternative source of livelihood have to be created, as a case observed in Kenya and Tanzania. And also some suggest that if you involve different stakeholders, you could also avoid the continued encroachment on restoration areas. The other aspect was on monitoring, management practices, and duration of projects. As we observe in Africa, many projects are short-lived and a period of 5 to 6 years. And after these have ended, there is no continued post-silviculture management, which really creates to failure of restoration projects. Additionally, Africa is characterized with diverse topography and diverse socioeconomic attributes. However, and also high degradation of forest lands, which really limits success of different silviculture approaches, for example, natural regeneration. And here respondents suggested to use assisted natural regeneration or to do active restoration through planting. In areas where assisted natural regeneration or active planting is conducted, they still face technical barriers like limited supply of seedlings in terms of quality and quantity, and also a problem of site-species matching. Having looked at the 5 main points, one also critical issue is the changes in socioeconomic attributes, such as market prices, which is also observed globally. And this implies that restoration projects have to be ready to adapt to changes both in socioeconomic and climatic aspects. With this, I'll try to give you illustrations and try to show you what really the impact of these findings on the ground using a case of Sodo and Bui in southern nations of Ethiopia. As we observe in the current slide, I want to give you impressions and ground level impacts of some of the socioeconomic and governance insights from dry atromontane forests in Ethiopia. Figure 3 and Figure 4 are all exclosures established 7 to 12 years ago. And in Figure 3, you see the blue cluster. These are patches being converted into croplands. And in Figure 4, these are the red clusters, which are currently being prepared for crop production through burning. One would ask a question, why a sudden conversion after all these years of exclosures? The main issue is the conflicting laws among institutions, especially between Forestry Department, Agriculture Department, and also the lack of legal mandate of forest lands and restored areas, especially in Ethiopia, which gives a room for easy conversion of forest lands into other land uses. Additionally, you realize that in Figure 3, there's a lot of mature or green patches of forest compared to Figure 4 with less green patches. This indicates the different aspects. For example, in Figure 3, there's high monitoring and protection by a group of communities called the cooperative. And this has led at least to the success of these exclosures in Figure 3 as compared to Figure 4, where there is no monitoring, there's no protection, and there's no management of these exclosures. This indicates also the different needs, the different goals of local communities and also restoration managers and institutions. For example, local communities here focus mainly on crop production, timber production, pulp production, and floats, of which restoration managers and institutions mainly focus on control soil erosion and also carbon sequestration. To summarize all this indicates that stakeholder involvement is very crucial. Especially here, you can identify the values, the beliefs, and the norms of the different actors, and design strategies, restoration practices that could create synergies between the different actors in terms of tangible and intangible benefits. Also, a crucial point is the creation of legal mandates of forest lands and forest restored areas. This is also crucial for the success of forest landscape restoration. With that, I would like to thank you. However, for those who need to get more knowledge on the success and failure of FLR, you could look at the article. The reference is there, and also the online survey is still online. Therefore, you can click on that link, and we'll be very happy to get your responses. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Vianney, for a very interesting presentation. I'd like to encourage you all to read that article. Now we have a couple of questions for our audience again. So we'd like to know how many of you have visited a restoration project. Again, on Slido, make sure you're in the right session. So how many of you have visited a restoration project? And we have a follow-up question to this one. So we have 2/3, 1/3 so far. 50-50. So it seems we don't have the follow-up question here. So we will move straight into the next presentation. So now I'm going to introduce work that we did with our UFRO scientists and a whole range of other scientists in 2019 on lessons learned on forest landscape restoration. So that will be a presentation by me. So I'm going to present a study that was carried out by our UFRO and a range of scientists in 2019, entitled Forest Landscape Restoration Implementation, Lessons Learned from Selected Landscapes in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The purpose of this study was to better understand the ecological, social, and economic dimensions of forest landscape restoration and to understand underlying challenges involved. It was also to better judge the progress made in achieving the Bonn Challenge goals. Our approach was to examine a range of landscapes as snapshots of FLR implementation under the bond challenge. All of the countries that were reviewed had bond challenge commitments. So we analyzed 17 landscapes in the following 9 countries: Bangladesh, Brazil, Ethiopia, Ghana, Guatemala, India, Madagascar, Mongolia, and Peru. In terms of methods, first a team of IUFRO scientists was set up that developed the methodology for this project. And then in each country, a lead scientist was identified, and he or she set up a local team of scientists. Landscapes were selected in each country, 1 or more landscapes per country, that represent a diverse array of ecological and socioeconomic conditions. In each landscape, some sort of restoration activities had to have been in place for about 10 years at least. Data was collected using a common methodology, which included field visits, review of the literature, project documentation review, and a standardized questionnaire, and local teams were responsible for collecting the data. The results were 60 lessons across all of the landscapes, and we divided those in 3 operating spaces, as you can see on the diagram on the right. The outer operating space being the governance space, followed by an FLR facilitation space, and then at the ground level, the field implementation space. 9 national reports were also produced, as well as 1 overarching report. And that main report presents 10 overarching lessons, which were distilled from the 60 lessons that emerged from all of the reports. So you can see on the right the front page of that report, which is downloadable from the IUFRO website. I'm going to now just talk you through 3 of those 10 lessons, just to give you a flavor. So the first lesson is to align expectations in project design. So there's a range of stakeholders in any given landscape, and each one may have different expectations. So a priority is to try to align those expectations, at least in the project design and implementation. So for example, in India, in Goa, the local communities favored cashew trees because of the alcohol they could brew from it. And yet the cashew trees was technically not the best species given the local conditions. So there was a misalignment there of expectations. And then just to give you a flavor of some of the implications for practice, at the governance level, decision makers should acknowledge and engage local leaders, both from governments and traditional authorities, to engage key stakeholders and promote open discussions on FLR objectives. In the next facilitation space, facilitators should promote opportunities and platforms where key stakeholders can discuss progress, necessary changes, and maintain open communication. And finally, at the level of the field implementation space, local stakeholders should fully participate so that legitimate claims to resources can be considered, accommodated, or compensated. The next overarching lesson I wanted to discuss is to strengthen collaboration and participation. And again, that's in recognition of the diversity of stakeholders involved in any given landscape. So, for example, in Ethiopia, the fact that a joint vision was developed for a future landscape that involved government agencies, administration at local and regional levels, as well as concerned communities, proved to be an essential determinant of success. In terms of implications for practice under this lesson, in the governance space, we find that decision makers should engage with stakeholders across multiple sectors, particularly through institutionalized stakeholder platforms. For example, in Guatemala, a forest landscape restoration board was set up at the national level that brought in many of these different sectors with a stake in the landscape. In the FLR facilitation space, facilitators should create opportunities for marked benefits for local communities to ensure high levels of participation and genuine ownership over the process. And finally, in the field implementation space, local stakeholders should participate in clarifying and prioritizing goals and objectives of FLR projects. The third lesson I wanted to discuss, which is important in the context of this session in particular, is the focus on capacity building and technical assistance. So, for example, in Guatemala, the institutions related to forest landscape restoration and the personnel that was directly involved needed to actually strengthen their technical capacities to develop projects and programs. At the same time, in Bangladesh and Brazil, it was found that field days provided an opportunity to transfer knowledge to farmers on cultivation of best practices and improved technologies, and also simply to learn by doing. In terms of implications for practice, in the governance space, decision makers should ensure that the capacity of policymakers is enhanced so that they are better able to understand and address interlinkages across sectors. While in the facilitation space, facilitators should prioritize extension services, particularly in some of the remote tropical regions where these landscapes that need restoration are found. In the field implementation space, local stakeholders should develop capacity on a range of site-specific aspects. So, for example, methods to reproduce and grow native species, seed collection, synergistic effects among species, etc. As a follow-up to this work, IUFRO is now working with in-country facilitators, and we're going to hear about from one in a short while, to develop their capacities. The initial focus is on Malawi and Sri Lanka. The aim is to provide facilitators with the skills to translate the FLR principles into meaningful local programs. So that's it for me. Thank you. So now, before we move on to our next presentation, we'd like to hear back from our audience. We have another poll for you. So the first question we have for you is, we would like to ask you now to vote with your feet. Which kind of shoes do you wear? Which kinds of shoes do you wear most often when taking action in restoring landscapes? So you may be taking action in restoring landscapes sitting at your computer. Do you do that barefoot, or do you do that with fancy shoes? You may be actually in the field. So we'd like to hear from you on what sort of footwear you have when you're doing restoration work. So far, we've got 50-50 between sneakers and work boots. Work boots are taking over. And this time we do have a second question for you, which is to also vote with your heart. Which of the 3 operating spaces that are presented do you think is most important for actually scaling up forest landscape restoration? So the governance space, or the facilitation space, or the implementation space? Implementation space, facilitation space are 50-50. Nobody seems interested in governance. Oh, a third each now. That's an interesting result so far. So I think we can move to our next presentation. I now have the pleasure to introduce Ida Janonta. Ida is an early career interdisciplinary social scientist. She's currently finishing a dual doctoral degree in Nature Society Studies, in Geography, and in Environmental Science and Policy at Michigan State University. Her current research interests are excuse me, on the human dimensions of global environmental degradation issues, with a focus on associated multi-level and multi-scale governance and institutional challenges, including applications to forest landscape restoration. She has wide-ranging professional experience in sub-Saharan Africa. Ida will talk about the governance space. Ida, the floor is yours.
Thanks to I4SPDC for organizing this virtual event. It's a real honor and pleasure to share this platform and to provide some insights on governance in implementing FLR interventions. I will first elaborate on some FLR-related governance challenges that my research has focused on, and then provide few research-informed potential actions to meet necessary governance features at implementation level, drawing on the case of Malawi. So part of my research has focused on understanding governance challenges with FLR, including mainly the challenge of governance integration in implementing FLR schemes. How to achieve strong integration across sectors, actors, and scales in a targeted landscape remains a major governance challenge for FLR interventions. Indeed, as landscape scale schemes, FLR interventions are uniquely multidimensional because they address interrelated policy issues across sectors involving various policy institutions, several local structures, and different actors. And the landscape approach, which represents the central management ethic and integrative process, requires significant interactions of sectoral institutions, integration of policy, and a cohesive management to avoid failure and negative trade-offs of silo management, and to amplify potential synergies for sustainability, especially at the forest-farm interface. Integrated governance is important to overcome non-aligned, discrepant, and inconsistent policy provisions and fragmented or incongruent implementation processes of connected restoration actions in the same landscapes, which often result into negative institutional externalities. Policy inconsistencies, for instance, include also resource tenure right issues. Integrated governance is also key to address challenges of inadequate knowledge mobilization and limited operational resources and capacity for implementations. Now, stakeholder engagement, which is a core FLR principle and an example of governance process that can contribute to integration, but it is often inadequate and constitutes another main governance challenge. Stakeholder engagement involves identifying who the stakeholders are, what are their roles and interests, their power relations, including level of influence, identify what institutional platform to use and to create if not available, and at what level for engaging stakeholders, having adequate managerial capabilities and skills and resources in place for navigating stakeholder processes, and establishing effective communication strategies and channels for awareness building, dissemination, meaningful engagement, and effective participation. But while we seem now to understand what those governance challenges are, the practical institutional arrangements and processes that will help realize governance integration in context, including effective cross-sectoral and cross-scale interactions for sustainable resource restoration, are still unclear. So my research interest centers on investigating that gap with the objective of articulating a suitable governance system supporting FLR efforts at implementation level. So drawing on a polycentric governance theoretical lens and studying the case of Malawi, I focused on key interactions essential for the performance of a sound governance system and the structures and processes that shape them. I draw out 4 main insights in terms of potential actions to enhance or achieve effective integrated governance. And these insights actually resonate with some of the practical governance implications articulated by Stentoff et al. And while the insights that I'm going to share with you are from studying the context of Malawi, they can be applied to other contexts sharing similarities with Malawi. So the first insight is to increase the extent of intersectoral and cross-scale cooperation by mitigating the challenge of limited collaboration and partnership arrangements among local entities leading restoration activities and also among other concerned policy actors. For instance, in Malawi, that means encouraging existing and more formal arrangements and space for collaboration, and expanding and formalizing existing sharing arrangements among resource governance bodies to enhance their limited operational resources, including knowledge for restoration. The second insight is that competition can be good, but it is often counterproductive and undermines restoration. So addressing unhealthy competitions, which is often sustained by incongruent implementation approaches and policy provision, is important for two reasons. First, mitigating any related negative impact, particularly over limited incentive and benefits. And second, addressing inequitable redistribution of scarce resources for restoration operation and of restoration benefits by using context-appropriate arrangements. For Malawi, for instance, this means to harmonize incentive mechanisms through changes in district-level bylaws and in higher level regulation, and also enhance equitable resource distribution among resource governance bodies, including through changes to the internal rules to foster equitable costs and benefits sharing for restoration. The third insight is to enhance social learning and to monitor the quality of arrangement and processes designed to meet institutional and ecological fit as part of some enabling mechanism to help maximize self-reflection, course correction, and flexibilities in terms of adaptive management. And in Malawi, for instance, it means to formalize and institutionalize and strategically plan social learning processes and activities, rather than leaving them just as incidental as it is often the case. Concretely, learning occurring through sharing of knowledge and experiences among resource governance bodies could be harnessed, and multi-stakeholder platform offered by the decentralization policy could be used more meaningfully to support deliberative processes among state and non-state technical officers and traditional authorities across scale. Further, any adaptive scalar rearrangements to realize institutional and ecological fit need attention regarding differential power relations that affect their effectiveness in order to mitigate risk of collective restoration failure. And the last insight is to establish persistent intersectoral and cross-sectoral and cross-scale coordination processes to preempt and mitigate negative institutional externalities and to build or strengthen conflict resolution mechanisms. And in Malawi, this may mean to strengthen the capacity of policy institutions offering venues for cross-sectoral coordination and redefine the steering function and managerial needs accordingly, enable more joint planning and joint decision-making at appropriate venues at district level to catalyze and formalize synergies and enhance the quality and frequency, engage in voluntary and mandatory processes and loose contact or reciprocal arrangements, including joint implementation and monitoring, enhance and systematize available reporting mechanisms across scale and within sectors, which actually perform some sort of coordination and accountability functions. And finally, reinforce conflict resolution mechanisms by local and district level authorities and build appropriate check and balances in the governance system where they are missing. So those were the insights I wanted to share with you. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Ida, for that very interesting presentation on the very important governance space. So now we're going to stay in Malawi, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Steve Makungwa. Steve is a senior lecturer, researcher, and director with over 18 years of experience at the Lilongwe University of Agriculture and Natural Resources. He holds a PhD in geosciences, an MSc in social forestry, and a BSc in agriculture. And he's the founder of the Center for Applied Systems Analysis, CASA. Steve is the GLF Lilongwe chapter coordinator a knowledge specialist responsible for managing the team and the overall activities of the Malawi chapter, including knowledge management within the community. So Steve will talk to us about the second level in that diagram, the facilitation space. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, the moderator of this session. My talk will build on what my colleagues have already presented. So my presentation will focus on the second operating space, where we're looking at the facilitation or how do we build the capacities of the facilitators of forest landscape installation. And this presentation, we are using Malawi as a case, where UFRO and CASA have been implementing a project on the practical capacities on forest landscape restoration in order to enhance restoration in Malawi. The way we had approached this capacity building of our facilitators, we divided this into two major categories. The first category is where we were providing facilitation training workshops. We had a series of workshops that the whole purpose was to provide theoretical background about forest landscape restoration to the frontline staff who are our facilitators. And we looked at the different aspects of forest landscape restoration. We had about 7 of them, and some of them that we had actually took the facilitators through. First of all, to have that understanding of what forest landscape restoration is, more especially looking at the definition of forest landscape restoration. What are the concepts that are linked to forest landscape restoration? How different is forest landscape restoration from tree planting, or maybe the traditional way of managing our forests or planting trees? So we felt this is the first thing that our facilitators, they need to have knowledge on before they go into details about forest landscape restoration. And we did also realize that issues of governance are key in forest landscape restoration if you are to get success in forest landscape restoration. We are looking at the intersection of governance issues and forest landscape restoration process, at what governance issues are applicable on what stage of forest landscape restoration is another key aspects that we took through our facilitators to ensure that they can manage governance issues throughout the process of forest landscape restoration. And then we also provided capacity on how they can design a forest landscape restoration. Looking at forest landscape restoration involves many stakeholders from different sectors and also at different scales. There's some complexities related to this forest landscape restoration. How do you design such type of project? What are the available frameworks that can help to design a project that can actually successfully being implemented under those complex situations? This is where we had introduced it to our facilitators about the project cycle management framework, PCM, which would be able to manage all the issues, the complexities, and also uncertainties that may arise as you are implementing forest landscape restoration. Then, having designed the project, we have now to go into the implementation of the project. Our facilitators need also to have understanding of the mechanics that are related to forest landscape restoration. This is where they needed to have knowledge of what factors they needed to consider in selecting particular methods or particular tools or approaches to forest landscape restoration. They may also look at what species to select and what planting techniques they can use in order to achieve their ultimate desire. So these are the mechanics of forest landscape restoration that we expected our facilitators to have knowledge upon. Having gone through the implementation process, the monitoring aspects was also seen to be crucial and very important that these facilitators need to have knowledge about what to monitor and how to monitor. And those are key questions that we had taken through our facilitators so that they can manage the outcomes or the outputs and even the impacts of the project itself. And then the communication was seen to be also important. How do they communicate forest landscape restoration? This is a soft knowledge, which may previously people haven't taken this seriously. But we do realize that for us to engage all the key stakeholders in forest landscape restoration, issues of communication are crucial and are very, very important. The communication could be communicating within the players or the stakeholders of a particular landscape, which is within themselves, or communicating with the outside world. All these are people with interest in forest landscape restoration. What would be the best mode of communication that can be implemented? And how do we reach out to maybe to the locals? In what language do we need to put all these things together? How do we translate the technical language to make sure that everybody understands the benefits that are supposed to be provided in there? How do we communicate with the people, the financiers, so that they can understand what you're talking about and be able to give us resources to implement our forest landscape restoration activities? So communication was seen to be critical in order to achieve expanded restoration of landscapes within our country. And finally, issues of financing is another critical, or is another barrier. And then the facilitator needs to know, where do the money come from? Who do we really need to provide the resources? How do we bring up the mix of different sources of finances that are already on the table? So we thought this is also one practical aspect that our facilitators need to have knowledge on and be able to appreciate about all this. So these are the issues that our facilitators need to have capacity on, to have knowledge on, to have the skills on, so that they can actually be the game changers. They can be the change agents in order to transform our degraded landscapes that we have in the country and also in Africa. Having gone through this classroom training workshops that we had conducted, we now move to another stage, another level, which we called mentorship program. This is where now we're introducing the trainees or the facilitators, the people that are undergoing this training, to the actual work on forest landscape restoration issues with local stakeholders. We are moving from the classroom, now we are going right on the field, where now the trainees, they needed to interface with the real issues of forest landscape restoration on the ground. How we approached it was that we identified key interventions that are being done in the target landscape that we are working on. And we noted that there are three major themes or thematic areas or interventions that are being implemented in the landscape. One of them was promoting agricultural technologies, the agricultural technologies that can improve land productivity and also be able to become climate resilient. So we had a group of our frontline staff with interest into that area that we are now focusing on this area, working with our local stakeholders and be able to learn from them and find solutions together and be able to get through that particular process. Within the agricultural technologies, the technology-specific interventions that we are actually looked at are farmer-managed natural generation, agroforestry, and also conservation agriculture as the key interventions that the facilitators, they worked with the local stakeholders, the farmers on the ground, taking them through the entire process. So in so doing, also learning something from them. The second aspect that intervention that one other group focused on was on the modern cookstoves for health forests. This was the demand side of forest landscape restoration. We know these are the drivers in our context in Malawi. Firewood and charcoal production is one of the drivers of forest creation in the country. So managing the demand of this firewood and charcoal by looking at the alternatives, or maybe looking at the means that can efficiently utilize the wood that is currently available, would add value or will preserve the existing forests within our landscapes. So through this, the facilitators were engaged with the project where they are promoting modern cookstoves like the ceramic cookstoves, which is in local language we call it tetezombaula, which is found to be using a third of the wood that would have been used if you are using a 3-stone fireplaces in the country. Is much more efficient. And the project itself also provided the capacity to the local women in the target area how to make this the cookstoves, ceramic cookstoves locally using the local materials. So there was that interaction between our facilitators and the local people on the ground to acquire this technology, and they were able to make these cookstoves and be able to be locally available within reach, within their communities. And within that also, they went further in looking at the ultra-efficient cookstoves, which are the microgas-fired cookstoves, which are more efficient. And they utilize the biomass waste into briquettes. And these briquettes are the ones that are used for producing energy in the microgas-fired cookstoves. So these are the demand side interventions that our staffs have been engaged into as part of experiencing interfacing with the real issues of forest landscape restoration on the ground. So, ladies and gentlemen, with getting through all this as a country, we have learned a number of lessons, and also as implementers, a number of lessons that we want to share with you. In the first lesson that we have learned was that orientation of the local experts in forest landscape restoration was found to be valuable in our context. What we did, we brought together experts from different sectors, the local experts in the country from different sectors, from agriculture, from forestry, from mass communication, others from economics, who had no forest background before. We brought them together and take them through the forest landscape restoration process. They really appreciated, and this also built a trusted relationship between different experts from different disciplines, and be able to, they united by their passion to address issues of forest landscape restoration. It was something that we found to be valuable, that's one way of bringing different disciplines together and address a common enemy, a common challenge that we are experiencing as Africa. These are some of the issues that we thought we needed to share with you. Thank you.
Many thanks, Steve, for an excellent overview of your work in the facilitation space. Now we move down to the implementation space, and I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Apollinaire Azafima-Tratra. Apollinaire is a forest engineer with a PhD in environmental sciences on forest landscape restoration. He's currently coordinator of the network of communities managing natural resources at WWF Madagascar. He has been FLR program manager in the Fandrine Marolambe landscape in Madagascar for the last 10 years. He coordinated both technical and governance issues in the landscape. A field man, Apollinaire enjoys developing and maintaining relationships with different actors, including local communities. In the FLR project he managed, he was able to create spaces for direct and regular exchange between stakeholders and to help develop land use compromises. Apollinaire will talk to us about the implementation space. Although multilingual, Apollinaire will present in French. Apollinaire, over to you.
Bonjour, je veux donc vous présenter l'espace de la mise en œuvre dans le cadre de cette session sur le savoir-faire nécessaire pour une restauration réussie des paysages forestiers en Afrique. Et je vais vous présenter ici le cas de la restauration forestière du paysage forestier de Fandrine Marolambe à Madagascar. Ce paysage forestier de Fandrine Marolambe est situé au centre-est de Madagascar et constitué des forêts intactes et forêts dégradées, des savanes et des terrains de culture. Et la problématique principale est la déforestation par les cultures surbrûlées, par la culture du riz pluvial et par la culture de la canne à sucre, les feux incontrôlés et l'exploitation illicite de produits ligneux et non ligneux. Les objectifs du processus de la restauration du paysage forestier de Fandrine Marolambe sont triples. Le premier est la conservation de la biodiversité, le deuxième est la restauration des biens et services écologiques, et le troisième est l'amélioration du bien-être de la population. Quelles sont alors les activités et les principaux résultats de la restauration du paysage forestier de Fandrine Marolambe? Il y a trois types d'activités. Le premier type d'activité est la concertation et la recherche de compromis avec l'élaboration d'une vision commune. Ce premier type d'activité avait pour objectif la constitution de groupes plus légitimes et plus inclusifs, acceptables, acceptés par tout le monde, et la détermination aussi des actions et des activités. Donc, cette activité a permis la réalisation de concertation au niveau de 70 communautés locales sur 149 et la détermination des activités de 5 itinéraires techniques de restauration active, 3 itinéraires techniques de restauration passive et 7 techniques culturelles alternatives et un renforcement de filières commerciales. Le deuxième type d'activité est constitué par des expertises. Les expertises avaient pour objectif le renforcement des capacités techniques des groupes appelés à mettre en œuvre les activités de la restauration. Donc, les réalisations sur les expertises sont les 18 études inventaires effectuées, le suivi des revenus des 49 ménages, les 140 pépinières formés, les 554 paysans formés. Et le dernier type d'activité est constitué par les accompagnements techniques et organisationnels de la mise en œuvre, qui avait pour objectif l'amélioration de l'efficacité et de la qualité de la mise en œuvre. Les réalisations relatives à ce dernier type d'activité sont les 73 sites de restauration active, les 50 sites de restauration passive, le 1 million de plans environ de 100 essences forestières natives plantées, les plus de 159 plants de fruitiers plantés, et ceci en travaillant avec 20 organismes et partenaires. Quels sont donc les principaux résultats? C'est la restauration forestière active et passive sur plus de 6 000 hectares, une diminution significative du taux de déforestation inférieur à 1%, 1400 ménages qui pratiquent les activités alternatives, l'augmentation de 32% de la moyenne des revenus des communautés, 187 notables, leaders qui ont participé sur l'alphabétisation fonctionnelle, et le processus a permis aussi à la construction de 9 bornes fontagnes pour satisfaire les besoins de 413 ménages dans le paysage. Ce sont donc les activités, les principaux résultats. Et maintenant, je veux vous présenter les leçons apprises à Madagascar et aussi pour les acteurs en Afrique. Les leçons apprises sont présentées ici, suivant les types d'activités présentées précédemment. Par rapport à la constitution des groupes légitimes et plus inclusives, 4 leçons apprises sont notées. Il faut une dimension sociale forte, il faut renforcer les structures de gouvernance locale, il faut s'engager à long terme et concevoir une stratégie de sortie. Donc, ce sont ces 4 leçons apprises qui sont indispensables pour vraiment arriver à appuyer les groupes locaux pour qu'ils aient l'acceptation et l'adhésion de tous les acteurs. Et sur la détermination des activités, il faut le suivi qu'il faut intégrer dès la phase de l'initiation. Et par rapport aux expertises, 3 leçons apprises ont été notées. Il faut mettre en œuvre avec des connaissances scientifiques mais avec la considération aussi des connaissances et des savoirs locaux. Il faut commencer par les renforcements techniques et organisationnels pour soutenir à différents niveaux le processus de la restauration forestière, et il faut établir des partenariats à plusieurs niveaux et avec différents acteurs. Et les 3 dernières leçons apprises liées aux activités d'accompagnement technique et organisationnel de la mise en œuvre sont les 3 points suivants. Il faut maintenir la flexibilité avec une réévaluation périodique du processus et de la mise en œuvre des activités. Il faut considérer l'échelle, concilier l'échelle des sites et du paysage. Et la dernière leçon, c'est la considération des activités de la restauration qui doit être complémentaire avec les activités de la protection. Ceci termine ma présentation. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Apollinaire, pour cette présentation très intéressante. So now we switch back to English and back to our audience. For our last audience poll, we would like to hear from you. Which skill could you personally develop to maximize your impact in scaling up forest landscape restoration? So we'd like to hear what sort of skills do you really think need to be developed to maximize impact in forest landscape restoration? And maybe you can think of skills situated in the 3 different operating spaces that we presented as well. So any specific skills in the governance space or in the facilitation space, or more specifically in the implementation space. Negotiation is definitely a very critical skill, especially when you're working at larger scales like landscapes with lots of stakeholders. I would definitely agree with that one. Are there any specific technical skills that people feel that need to be developed? Coordination skills? I'm sure there must be other skills that people can think of. Are there any skills related to working with different local communities? Are there any particular skills with respect to the different species that need to be used? Are there any skills with respect to dealing with authorities, to understanding policies? We're seeing financial skills being important. Okay, well, while you still think maybe about those, we will move to a panel discussion. I've got some questions for our panelists, so I'd like to ask all our panelists to put their videos back on, please. And I'm going to ask them to answer a couple of questions, and as well as taking some questions from the audience. So the first question I'd like to ask each of you to address, given that we asked the audience which of the 3 operating spaces is most important, I'd like to hear from you. Which one do you think is the most important? And I'm going to start in the reverse order, maybe from the speakers. So Apollinaire, lequel des 3 domaines opérationnels, soit la gouvernance, la facilitation ou la mise en œuvre, te paraît être la plus importante?
Oui, merci beaucoup pour la question. Je pense que les 3 espaces sont évidemment liés, connectés, et que la réussite des 2 premiers espaces amène favorablement à celle de la mise en œuvre. Néanmoins, ça dépend des acteurs aussi bien sûr. Pour les communautés, je pense que c'est plutôt l'espace de mise en œuvre qui devrait être le plus important. Mais pour les agents de l'administration, c'est l'espace de la gouvernance. Et donc, pour les ONG, comme WWF par exemple, je pense que c'est plutôt l'espace de facilitation. Merci.
Merci, Apollinaire. So yes, the importance of the space being associated with the stakeholder group. Steve, what are your thoughts? Which space would be most important?
I think I would say all the spaces, because each space has got its role to play in the entire process of landscape installation. Even from the presentation, we saw that the governance space has got its particular role in providing enabling environment in order to enhance landscape installation at the ground. So if that the capacity is provided and that space is able to to conduct or do what they are meant to do, then I think the environment will be more conducive for enhancing forest landscape restoration at the ground. Similarly, at the facilitation level, these are the game changers. These are the ones that facilitate the changes on the ground. And also the work as an interlink between the policy and the people at the ground. So we look at this as also very important space. They need to have all the technical know-how. They need to have all the soft skills to make sure that forest landscape restoration is actually accelerated on the ground. So their role again is very crucial, very important. They are the game changers. Similarly, now the last space, which is the local stakeholders, the farmer themselves, they are the doers. They're the one connected to the land. So we see that all the three spaces have to really work together if we are ready to to move forward with the forest landscape installation. I think that's what I would really say, without really saying this is much more important than the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Ida, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. I may repeat my colleagues in answering your question, but my take on that question is that none of the three operating spaces is less important. And as you rightly said, I see them actually intertwined and influencing each other. For instance, as while I focused on the governance, right, in my speech, but some of the action I mentioned about are to consider during implementation. So you may have realized that I talked about actions at the implementation level where you have the FLR intervention being implemented, but it's governance processes. It's about governance processes during implementation. So you see the connection, the links between the spaces of governance, implementation, and event facilitation as that's how I conceived it, right? And so enhancing or activating governance processes will also help the facilitation and also help the implementation space for FLR schemes.
Thank you, Ida. And Vianney, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Stefan. Yeah, my thoughts are similarly the same, no space is more important than the other. However, from the practical perspective, I would say the field implementation is really crucial because in Africa, policies are done, processes and strategies are set. But when you go to the ground level, the implementation phase field is really missing. And here really we have these actors in the implementation phase who are really changing the landscape due to their day-to-day activities. They farm in the lands, they do livestock grazing in the lands, and they have different goals, different values, and all these aspects come in. So the field implementation would be crucial, but as Ida and Steve said, you have to interconnect these phases and like right now we are talking about upscaling of FL activities, and that means we have now to interconnect these cases. Otherwise, we shall not have effective implementation of FL activities.
Thank you. So I guess we are all in agreement that all three spaces are important and the linkages across the three. And depending on your stakeholder group, different spaces might carry a bit more weight at certain points. So Another question is, when you see the ambitious restoration targets set by governments in Africa and around the world, and based on your own experience, what would be your top piece of advice for an African government official with respect to restoration? And again, maybe I'll start with Apollinaire. So Apollinaire, quel serait ton conseil principal aux gouvernements africains qui ont des objectifs ambitieux de restauration des paysages forestiers?
Merci beaucoup, Stéphanie. Je pense que en Afrique et surtout à Madagascar, je pense que le renforcement de la gouvernance locale et la mobilisation communautaire constituent les deux points qui méritent d'être priorisés. Pourquoi? Parce que l'État est limité pour différentes raisons au niveau de ses capacités pratiques d'être sur terrain. Et ce sont donc la gouvernance locale et les communautés qui remplacent, disons, ces limites et qui garantissent en fait la réalisation, à la fois la réalisation et la durabilité. Donc, pour moi, je pense que c'est ce renforcement de la gouvernance locale et l'aspect de la mobilisation communautaire qui sont importants. Merci.
Merci, Apollinaire. So yes, a strong local governance focus. Steve, what would be your advice to an African government official with respect to scaling up restoration and to meet those targets?
Yes, the targets are just numbers, which countries have put themselves that, okay, for example, Malawi, we are saying 4.5 million hectares, and it might look scary, but I already think that should be just a guiding to guide us, to let us know that we need to accelerate, we really need to do something faster now, as opposed to really looking at the numbers themselves. What is important are the activities, what is happening on the ground. Can we really increase the forest cover on the ground? Can we really restore the degraded, cultivated areas? I think that should be the way to look at what we have been able to achieve in the past, meaning that we can move to 2030 without having any form of fear or maybe being anxious that this is something that is really too difficult to achieve. African countries have done a lot, a lot of things in the past, which means that this can be something that is achievable. We can be able to achieve a significant change in our landscape as we move into the 2030. So yes, let's not be so anxious. Let's take an action every day. Let's not say, okay, 2030 is just maybe we haven't done anything at all, but any little thing that we're able to do, it will really bring us to another level. I think that's what I would say to the African leaders regarding the targets that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Ida, what would be your piece of advice?
Giving advice is difficult because, I mean, from a scientific perspective, we can give much advice, but it's about the practical realization of them. So there are a lot of things to say here. And from my perspective, I think African government needs to show more accountability regarding the pledges, and that is to put in place the really enabling policy framework and conditions to translate their commitment into actions. And that means to get to address what we have identified as bottleneck and disincentives for implementing FLR interventions. I personally think that the knowledge is sometimes there, and it is how or the ways in which they can tap into those knowledge to change the inertia and to change the status quo about those challenges. I think that's one aspect. There is now a huge momentum to secure funding from the private sector, which is one way to get FLR schemes financed, but showing also their own contribution. I mean, for instance, setting up country-owned funding for specific FLR intervention. We've seen the example with Malawi, with the youth program, even if we still need time to see how that will unfold, but at least it's a bold commitment and action, practical action from the government themselves, putting the taxpayers' money, say, okay, we want to get in now, private sector can accompany us. So those are bold indication of the willingness beyond just targets. And another thing is to strive to harness the many synergies that exist among existing funding. I mean, that is not only wait for new fundings to come, but how to integrate FLR across existing funding can also be a way to get the train, start, and then things will come as they move on. And the last thing that I will mention is to show accountability through monitoring. Monitoring of not only restoration activities, but also assessment of the outcomes, right? Both socio-economic and ecological outcome. That is extremely important to demonstrate restoration success and the worthiness of keeping funding FLR interventions. So I will just stay for that now. Yeah.
Thank you for a very comprehensive answer, Ida. Vianney, what would you give as advice?
For my case, I'll start with Ida's point. Sure, we need transparency and accountability from the African governments, because there are a lot of funds which is coming in to implement, to do forest landscape restoration activities. But my advice would be to at least formulate or set up a forest landscape restoration unit that can really ensure accountability, transparency, monitoring, and effectiveness and efficiency of these FLR programs and strategies. That will be one aspect. This can be established at the federal level and spread out to the local level. This can also be really added or helped with capacity building of the local actors, both in the federal level and also the site level. The other issue which I've really observed, governments have tried to do restoration on site. That's true. But after restoring the land, after 2-5 years, again, the local community is coming, and again, the land is shifted to other land use. And then you ask yourself, why did we invest a lot of money for restoration? So I would suggest African governments have to really demarcate and certify the forest lands which are currently there, and also restored areas. And here, by certifying, they clarify the land use rights, ownership, and different which stakeholders, actors use this land, own this land. With this clarification and the laws between the Agriculture Ministry and the Forestry Ministry, because most cases within the landscape, this entangle. So these all have to be clarified. And with this, I think we would see more success in restored lands.
Thank you, Vianney. So firstly, I'd like to encourage people to ask their questions on the Q&A, and I'm turning to those questions. We have one question that kind of follows on from what you were saying, Vianney, and some of the other speakers as well, which is that policies in some countries are seemingly weak because there's a lot of encroachment in forest reserves. So there's an assumption that restoration is happening within forest reserves. And to me, what I'm seeing here is some of the critical aspects is about engaging the communities, actually really engaging them in restoration and at that implementation operating space that we were talking about, but also making sure that you've got that right environment, policy environment that some of you mentioned, as well as addressing tenure. And maybe that is something that we haven't really discussed in great detail. And maybe that's something in the enabling environment that's really important. So I don't know if any of you would like to say something about that. I'm sure Ida will have something to say about tenure.
Yeah, tenure issues are really crucial. I have like examples of how tenure can be bottleneck or challenge even implementation. For instance, I was talking with NGOs, actors, and they were telling me we have this watershed to restore, but nobody has secure tenure of the land in that watershed. So people are not motivated. Why invest in those land if they're not going to, benefit it for a long time on a long run? So they were finding ways to at least circumvent the issue for a short term, but that's still not like the solution, right? So there's really need to work on tenure issue and secure tenure, both tree tenures, land tenures for people, and to encourage them to invest in the land and to invest in restoring the degraded land. Yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to say something on tenure, or should we move to another question? I have another question. Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
No, I just wanted to get back to the question that a participant actually put forward regarding the weak policies. I wouldn't say that the policies are really weak. I think forest landscape restoration is a new concept, is a new phenomenon. We are all learning. We are learning by doing. We think that many African countries have made a stride in developing forest landscape restoration strategies, which again regulate the way forest landscape restoration is being done. And this is a new event. Many of the countries just maybe the last 2 or 3 years that they are developing this. An example is Malawi. We had developed this in 2017. And we are still learning regarding how best can we really implement the strategy. So as we are, as for landscape restoration, you talk about adaptive management. So it's learning by doing. So some of the things that we're experiencing, we can actually learn from it and improve on it and be able to move towards and reaching our targets in 2030. So if we can develop that attitude of positivity, that yes, we do realize things are not well, but we can do better from where we have failed ourselves and be able to move forward. We think that would be the way to go. Even the issues of land tenure, because that's what we had lived in the past, many centuries. It's just that we have come into this new concept. Then these are now, we have realized that our barriers. How do we manage it? We don't expect them to be done overnight. It might take a bit of time, but we need to continue engaging ourselves. That is why the 3 operating spaces, to me, they are the motivators, governance spaces. What are the right mix of regulation and policies which can enhance forest landscape restoration at the ground? So these are the issues that if the policymakers have that knowledge and understanding and be able to appreciate that for us to move this, we need to do A, B, C, D, I think we can make a big difference. So let's look at it from that angle, and then from there, we'll be able to move forward and enhance our forest landscape restoration on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. We have a question on financing and on the sustainability of a restoration effort, and how to make sure that projects don't just end when funding stops. So the question's in French, and I will actually turn to Apollinaire for that question, because I know that he was working on the Fandrine and Marolambe landscape for 10 years, and the project was actually a 13-year project. So the question is, Apollinaire, la plupart des projets stoppent quand le financement finit. Donc, comment faire pour s'assurer que le projet soit durable? How do you make sure that project is sustained beyond the financing? Apollinaire?
Oui, ok. Merci beaucoup pour la question. Je pense que c'est c'est un point central de la difficulté de la restauration de paysages forestiers. Ce qui a été fait, par exemple, à Madagascar, c'est que il y avait différentes phases. En fait, la première phase, c'était la phase de préparation. La deuxième phase, c'est la phase de négociation avec les communautés, les premières activités de restauration. Après, c'est la phase de mise en place disons, de mécanismes de financement. Et après, c'est le renforcement des groupes communautaires, des sociétés civiles pour arriver après le passage du projet, à gérer les activités de la restauration. Donc, pour répondre directement à la question, je pense que d'abord, il faut ce financement. Il faut trouver un mécanisme de financement qui doit être durable, mais en plus, il faut l'engagement, il faut l'engagement des communautés à travers la gouvernance locale. Donc, il faut vraiment organiser les communautés, il faut négocier avec eux, il faut leur donner la décision, par exemple, d'attribuer les terrains à restaurer pour que, après la fin du projet, les communautés continuent à respecter les sites, les zones à restaurer, et donc renforcer les communautés, les acteurs locaux, même après les activités la durée du projet. Et en rapport avec le financement, tout à l'heure, il faut aussi voir et travailler avec les besoins de communauté. Est-ce qu'il y a des filières commerciales qui peuvent être, disons, qui peuvent marcher au niveau local? Est-ce que les conditions sociales des communautés, par exemple, j'ai parlé tout à l'heure pendant mon exposé de bornes-fontaines pour l'eau des communautés. Ce sont des petits trucs qui aident pour cette question après la fin du projet. Merci.
Merci, Apollinaire. So, yes, I think a change in the approach as well. So going beyond just thinking of projects and project money, but actually changing behavior so that it's sustained beyond the end of the project. I don't know if anyone else would like to say something about that question. Ida?
I can just add, ensure community ownership of the interventions, because once they think this is our thing and the benefits are for us, then they work with it. And that also depends on the type of incentive that I use during the project, right? So identify proper incentive, not only money-based incentive, but different types of incentive that are I would say integrated into the livelihood of people that will help ensure that after the project is finished, people will continue doing the work, continue restoring their lands, degraded lands. So work on the type of incentive. Usually we think that financial incentive are only the way to go, but I don't think so. And ensure ownership by the communities and also by the government actors. Yes.
Thank you. Vianney, would you like to say something before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'll just speak something small with regards to the project's ending. One thing I think we need now to channel how we use the project funds. For example, this could be channeled to training the local people within these landscapes on how to manage these restored areas, and also integrating some new strategies. For example, not only tree planting or but also involving these tree planting activities within their agricultural lands, within their boundaries at farm level. So giving them this knowledge and showing them that these initiatives have benefits, it also leads to them to be wanting to learn how to manage and to access the markets. And with this, whether the NGO leaves the landscape, the community will continue managing and will continue having products and benefits.
Thank you. Excellent point. And I think that is the whole purpose of our session, which was about actually changing, improving skills and actually therefore changing capacity and approach. So as we're coming to the end of our session, I would like to thank all our panelists. I'd like to thank UFRO and the GLF for giving us this opportunity. And of course, I'd like to thank our virtual audience for being there. With the right skills and know-how, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is a unique opportunity, and I hope that we can all collaborate on making it a real success in Africa and around the globe. So, well, thank you very much, everyone, and good restoration in the next 10 years and beyond. Thank you. And with that, we can close our session. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks a lot.